Hello, everyone. Great, I think everyone can hear me. Lovely, it's lovely to be here. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself first. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I wanted to talk to you today about frugal innovation, and I think the easiest definition, and you've heard a little bit during the conference about this. So frugal innovation, if you think about it, is not just coming out with products that are less expensive, but it's also going through the process of creating products in a way that's also as inexpensive as you can make it. And so for me, my story really began in the States and in Asia and in Europe when I was working for a big consulting and accounting firm. And so there, probably like many of you, I ended up working on a lot of enterprise applications that were hundreds of millions of dollars, processing business that was in the billions. But I'm originally from Ghana. And so I really, at some point, wanted to move home. And what I found was, I thought, this is the area where I could best fit in. Right? This is Accra, the capital, and there's big buildings, large companies, banks, telcos, where a lot of the experience that I had was probably most applicable. What I found was even the applications that we kind of built there were orders of magnitude smaller than what we ended up building in the West. And then what I realized is that we were really building for a population of maybe 1,000, 2,000. It really wasn't where the majority of business or life was on the continent. What Accra really looked like in terms of where the population is here. Right? So what we hear about, difficulty in getting running water, difficulty in getting electricity consistently, sometimes even at all, and a host of other challenges that meant that the kind of technology we were used to building in the West, or even in the large cities, really fell flat when you ended up trying to build applications for this part. And 70% of the population actually lives in villages that look like that, which become even more challenging to build for. With distance, not necessarily on any maps, you can't deliver things easily, address systems get even more complicated. And so what we sort of realized is that the way we thought about building technology had to change. And so we spent probably the last 10 years or so rethinking how we build technology for these environments. And what we found is that it's really building for constraints and solving the constraints that exist. And it's not so much the kind of technology that you use. Of course, what we found is that more advanced technology, whether you're thinking about drones or 3D printing, are great, but they're also quite expensive. And that we're still at the point, in 70% of the continent plus, where new age technology isn't necessarily what we need to actually start getting out solutions. We need to start thinking about the constraints and the kind of technology that fits the solutions for those particular constraints. And so we think of it as constraint-driven development. So when we start looking for solutions, we initially try to figure out exactly what the constraints are and how we build software to compensate for them. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what we mean by constraint-driven development. So these are the typical kind of constraints that you see. Power, electricity, connectivity. I'll talk a little bit more about that, because connectivity means that there's really one type of technology that we can build that fits the environment, and that's mobile. So other than in the large cities, large companies, you will find that we are really only building mobile solutions. We'll talk a little bit about that. Literacy is a huge consideration. People don't necessarily understand words that are written to them on the computers. So we actually end up having to rely on images, which you can imagine is also challenging when you think about connectivity. So literacy is something that we definitely consider. An address system, anybody who has to deliver anything, They typically say in Africa, the directions are, you go down the road. When you see the yellow house, take right. When you see the mango tree, take left. And then when you see the woman selling the yam, ask there. So that doesn't work very well with sort of delivery systems that are needed, especially when the mango tree is cut down. Yeah, no. Peripheral devices are very key. There have been strides, certainly, within the last 7 years, especially, I would say, but most people only had the feature phones initially, but increasingly more people have smartphones and can do more with their devices. But it's still a consideration because there is still a large feature phone base if people can get phones. And cash, payments, mobile transfer, all of that. I don't know if everybody has heard of M-Pesa, but M-Pesa was the huge success that happened in Kenya around mobile payments, probably almost 10 years ago now, where a huge percentage of the GDP, I think it was something like 25% of the GDP, was actually going through mobile payments. Many African countries have tried to replicate this, and many have failed. But everybody's still trying to kind of figure out how to get more people using mobile payments rather than have to deal with cash, which has a lot of complications as well. And so looking at these constraints, what we've found is that technology really fits into this area of jugaad, which is the Indian word for frugal innovation. In Ghana, we have a phrase called pak pak pa. Everybody talks about, you don't get much cash, you don't get much disposable income, but you still have to feed your family and make things happen. And how you do that is pak pak pa movements. So very much we realized that in building technology, it really was about how do we figure out how to frugally build solutions that were frugal outcomes themselves. And I'll give you some stories of that. But the first thing I'll do is I'll point out what is probably the biggest constraint out of all of these, which I actually haven't mentioned yet. And I'm going to tell you a story that is actually not technology related. So I have an uncle who's a physician in the US. And he moved there kind of around high school, but really felt like he had done well in the States as a medical doctor and wanted to come back to Ghana and give back. And started talking to some colleagues because what they thought they could do was come and help with family planning. Because there were a lot of families who had a lot of children, and typically, historically, people had a lot of children to help with all the farming. And so they really wanted to teach them family planning so they could manage their family size, so they could get better education for their kids, be able to feed all the kids properly, and all of that. So this sounded great. He got a lot of support, and quite a number of his colleagues kind of got together, they raised funds, they were coming down, so they said, okay, let's do this right? Let's get a bunch of villages in this area. You know the local language. You're going to help us figure out how to do a fantastic program. We're going to do monitoring and evaluation. We're going to come back after a year and measure how much we've actually decreased, in births and pregnancy. So they actually kind of wrote this all up. They went to the villages. They went to every household. They asked for permission from the men to actually take the women to a 2-day conference. They had the local language spoken. They made it participatory. And this family planning was all based on the pill. So they gave them all of this training on how to use the pill, what it did, all of that, and then thought, fantastic, we're going to come back and see results. We've done this right. So they leave, come back a year later, do their counts, and realize that incidence of pregnancy, up. Incidence of childbirth, up. We're like, what happened? This was a complete failure, really, by all the outcomes. So they started going around and trying to investigate what happened. They would ask the women, so did you understand everything we said? Oh, yes, everything was good. We understood every word. And you came for the whole 2 days? Yes, everything is good. And you took the pills? Yes, everything, fine. And they still wasn't making sense. They went to the husbands. Everything good? Were you annoyed that we took your wives for 2 days? No, everything is fine. It's good. It was good they went. And in further investigation, they finally asked the women, so what happened when you went home? And they said, well, when we went, our husbands told us to tell them everything that happened. And they said, okay, how did that go? It's all fine. He listened to everything. And what did the husbands tell you? They said, I am the man of this house. If anybody shall take that pill, it shall be me. And that's so representative of what we're doing in technology. We would put all this investment into trying to come up with a solution, and it would be one little thing that we would miss about the context in which the person was going to be using the technology that would make the entire thing fall flat. I had one of my former staff was in one of these competitions before she came to our company. And she had 2 colleagues, and they came up with an idea, entered one of these competitions, and got the prize was for them to go into a hub, nicely situated with air conditioning, nice desks for them, and a number of experts around the hub who would help them build great technology. And I remember what Christine said was that the minute she got into that room and the air conditioning was blowing in her face, she forgot all about the problem she had to solve. And so what we realize with technology is that context, even more so than all of the constraints, can make or break your system. So you really have to look at both the context and all the constraints. And the other piece about all the constraints that is really important to realize is that a while ago, people were talking about Africa as a mobile-first continent. Right? So over here on the left-hand side, we have what the connectivity around the entire continent, which is about 1.1 billion people now, what the connectivity looked like. It was essentially 2 cables. It was basically the SAT-3 cable that ran through just a few countries. This is already 4 years ago, but it hasn't changed significantly. But this was over 1,000% increase in the submarine cables that actually landed to the continent, and as you can see, significantly more connection points. And already, even by the time we had the SAT-3 cable, we had far outstripped the number of landlines we had on the continent in those few countries that were basically copper landlines. We had already outstripped it. So you can imagine what has happened to mobile connectivity since. Okay? So this already just ends 2 years ago. This is just a graph till 2016, but you can already see that mobile penetration was up to almost 80% on the continent. And this continues. Right? So really, it's not just mobile first, it's mobile only. So if you're thinking about any solutions on the continent, you really have to think about mobile first. Not necessarily just smartphones, but USSD, SMS in particular, those kinds of solutions is how you actually get out to the 70% who are not necessarily living in the cities, who don't necessarily have smartphones. So let me tell you a few stories about what we've been able to do, sort of understanding this world of constraints and context. So this gentleman here is a Ghanaian, and I used to work with him as well. And one of the things that he did, when he was a student, quite gifted, actually started taking university classes before university age. And his biggest headache was data to be able to connect to the internet. And what you realized, particularly at that time, was that the data cost would go down at around midnight and come back up at around 5 p.m. So it would be cheaper to do all your browsing on the internet and any materials he had to learn, kind of all the technology that he was trying to learn, all of that. It was better for him to do it from 12 to 5 a.m., which was also his prime time for sleep. So what he ended up doing was building an open source browser called Ananse. Ananse is a very clever spider, sort of like Brer Rabbit or any one of those. We talk about Ananse. So he built this browser, and what the browser did was that it was a bit smart. So very simple browser, not a lot of functionality in it, but the one thing that it would do is keep your favorite sites. And at midnight, it would turn on, it would go bring the latest copies when the bandwidth was cheaper, and store them for you. so that by the time you got up at 6 o'clock, you could actually read the latest news or the latest articles or whatever had been updated on your site. So that's just one example of how we sort of work around the connectivity constraints and sort of optimize that time. Right. And then you also found that it really addressed poor download speeds as well, because at midnight to 5 a.m., there are not a lot of people who are actually on the internet as well. So that really helped. So that's just one example of kind of moving around the constraints. This was another example by a company called SoftTribe. SoftTribe is actually owned by Herman Chinwe Hesse, who a lot of people sort of called the father of software development on the continent. But what they ended up doing is they had a number of solutions where they actually needed to collect payment. And starting out mobile, and they were really trying to sort of address the bottom of the pyramid, the people who make less than $1 a day, right? And so to do that, they don't necessarily have smartphones, they don't necessarily have the ability to use mobile payments because a lot of those require an app to be installed. And so what he ended up doing was just building a simple scratch card, just like you would to scratch and refill your prepaid mobile payments. So you would pay the money and get the value on the card, it would get issued to you. You would have that card, and when you're ready to use it on whatever solution they had, you would actually be able to type in the card number, and by SMS, it would actually go to a laptop which had a SIM card in it. And that SIM card would actually put in another message to a second laptop now, a validation laptop, which would verify the amount of money that was on that ID and send a verification number back to the user that they could then enter in. Now, the interesting thing about this is even though it's really simple using SMS, of course, the big consideration is around security. So how do you secure a system like this? Very simply, only the processing laptop knows the SIM number for the validation laptop. And the validation laptop is never in the same location as the processing laptop. Because it's SMS, you can actually do it around the city. And so what they would do is they would take the validation laptop and literally go lock it in different places. That was all they had to do. So no complicated SSL necessarily, no complicated validation or verification, literally just using physical security to secure the validation laptop. And then only 2 people need to know where it is at any one point in time, or even what it is. Thought that was an interesting story. And this is another interesting story that's really all about context. So one of the things that we have in Ghana is this, and it's not just Ghana, there's a number of countries in South Africa and other parts of Africa as well, where we have this social culture of thievery. People who are stealing are not accepted at all. So if I went into the marketplace in Accra today and I shouted thief, or in the local language, it's julo, hey julo, hey thief, people would stop what they're doing, they would drop it, they would chase that person down, and they would beat you into an inch of your life. It is not a joke. In some cases, they've actually put a tire on people and lit it. So there's a lot that's going to try and get it to not be so destructive and to let the law handle it where it should. But the idea was, okay, if this is the social phenomenon, if at least people will come to your rescue, why don't we leverage that when we're building a security solution? So Hey Julo is quite simple. You register on with your mobile number. You add in the number of 5 people in your house, up to 5 people in your household, up to 5 of your neighbors. And you can store it with like a short code. And if at any point in time you feel you're in danger, you simply press 1. And those phone numbers will actually get messages. They will also get phone calls. It will go to the police. It would also go to radio stations, who would get onto the radio station and say, house number 5577, next to the woman with this, they are being robbed. Go, 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 go. And people would run to your help. Now, that I thought was pretty inventive. Interestingly enough, it was never used much, because just by putting a sticker with "Hey Julo" and people knowing about this, the incidence of crime went down. Right? So, and a very simple thing, so this is also related to this former solution. So you would just buy a card, so you don't have to have security all year round if that's not what you want. You don't have to have a contract. You just buy the scratch card with the value. You can top up your account. And if you want security because there are many people in your house that weekend, you can get it for 2 days. So 1 CD or something, or less than a CD. You can actually get that. Yeah? And a CD is something like 5 cents, something like that. Yeah. So just another example. This is an interesting example, I thought, as well, out of Nairobi. So we have some of the worst traffic in the world, different places on the continent. Lagos is, I understand, the second worst city for traffic in the entire world. Nairobi is not too far behind. It is the 5th worst city for traffic. In Lagos, people sometimes actually just leave their car. Like the traffic is so bad, they get out of the car, they take it's called different things in different cities, but they take the motorbikes, Buddha, and they go home and come back the next day to find the car. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So how do you solve a challenge like that? Because part of the issue is that there was difficulty in getting solid information, right? And even now we have services. There are a lot of people who use Google Maps. There's also radio that can tell you about things. But how do you read the traffic flow to be able to advise people on where to go? So this was a solution, and they found that they could actually, relatively low expensively, get certain cameras and put them around the city. But the quality of the images were not great, right? Because the quality of the cameras are not that great. You can't afford to put high-quality cameras everywhere. And so what they did was they started figuring out how to read the black spaces in between cars. Like I can't tell if it's what the shape of the car is and how fast it's moving, but if I can at least look at empty spaces, and those are pretty consistent regardless of the road. If I can at least look at those empty spaces and see how fast those are being covered or uncovered, I can figure out the rate at which the traffic is moving on it. And so with that, they were able to then spatially detect what the traffic flow was. And then by SMS, you would actually get directions on the best route to take, thereby sort of distributing traffic around the city. Yeah. So that's another interesting example. This is one project that we've actually been doing, still do. Even though we talk about technology and the lack of it, one of the things that we find is that the continent has been a big waste dump for e-waste. And in Ghana in particular, we have the largest e-waste dump in West Africa. And it is acres and acres and acres of old computers and fridges and all kinds of stuff. And we actually partnered with an architecture firm. And the idea was, what you find in this part of the area is that there are a lot of kids and young adults who go into the e-waste dump, a lot of times without shoes, and they're sort of looking for something to do to get money. And so they'll look for like old mobile phones or old toasters and try and fix them. And they get to know one another, and they'll share parts with one another, but they're not necessarily taking out the parts in a safe manner. And they don't necessarily know how to build those things back together. And so we got involved to actually create a space for them to do that more safely. And so this, for instance, is actually a makerspace that's structured at the back. So we actually have a makerspace that can be deconstructed and moved to other places as well. You can see a lot of the trash around them. That's really what it looks like. And then we show them how to put them back together. But the main thing that we built from a technology side is that because these kids also don't necessarily know how to read, they know how to speak to one another in whatever local language it is, and they know how to look at pictures. So we actually were able to put diagrams together that they can actually share. So we did have to get them smartphones, for instance, that they can actually share and WhatsApp to one another. And they could say, oh, I'm looking for this part, or I've seen this, how do I take it apart? And they could share these diagrams. And they could trade as well on the platform. And so because they could trade these parts and they had this place where they could actually go to put things together, it really became a place where they could micro-manufacture various products to sell. The next phase really is to get them a shop online that can use some of these other technologies so they can actually start selling those products. This story is an example of social engineering. This is a very typical medical records location in any clinic or hospital across the country. All of those files, actually, you have to pay to get the file to store your medical records. You have to pay, I think it's now 8 cedis, which is about $1.50, $1.50 US dollars. So you pay to get that file, they put your medical records, and it goes into a container like that. But that's probably where it ends up. It ends up on the floor, these units get filled, the papers get strewn about, they get destroyed after 7 years, which is also terrible for your health information. In one clinic that we went into, we found 14 duplicates for just one person. Because once they put it into the folders, you see all the files are sort of spilling out, they're not organized well, you can't find it again. So we found that the average wait time in these OPDs was about 3 hours to see a doctor. And that 3 hours was attributed to them not being able to find your file. After 3 hours, they'll probably give up and say, you have to buy a new folder, we'll start your file again. Whatever is in there is never to be seen again. So we did something very simple. We took all the files out, we reorganized them, we put them into a very simple database, and we gave them barcode numbers, you see here at the bottom left. So each file then got a barcode number. We captured just 8 pieces of information: first name, last name, national health insurance number if you had it, phone number, next of kin name, their phone number. Phone number is important. People do not mess with their mobile phone numbers, and we found that out. And I'll tell you a little story too about how important those phone numbers became. And so we did a very simple barcode system. When you came, we would give you a card, or on your national health identification card, the sticker is on there for you. So we simply go find it, because we had them, we're very well organized now. So we knew exactly where to go to get the file. You would scan it out, and there you go. Now, it's a lot of work, right? So this, for example, is us working on cleaning up all the folders and the files behind the records office. And even that was fraught with challenges, because one of the things we found is that a lot of these kind of clinics and hospitals don't have steady power. So you can't carry a generator there. That's also very expensive to try and do this in multiple clinics and hospitals. And the clinic or hospital doesn't even have the funds for you to do it. So we actually would use car batteries. So car batteries, we would have cars to kind of move the people around. We could always charge the car battery, and it would give us about 2 hours on a laptop, additional work even when the lights went out. And so we would work 24/7 to kind of get all the records into this, be able to get them scanned in. And what we found is that this is a typical records area. This is not how it looked before. Before, it would be chock full of people. And what we found is that those 3 hours that people would spend waiting went down to 10 minutes. It only took 10 minutes to find the files and bring it back. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And what we did as well is that you found that there were a lot of elderly people who didn't stay at home because there wasn't necessarily anything for them to do. They would actually go to the clinics, and they would sit in the clinics. And they would just sit there the whole day as if it was work and get up and go. And so what we found is that if we gave them the job to go around and actually collect if for some reason the card hadn't been returned from the doctor's office, they would go and collect all of those cards, those medical records. Because what we found is that a lot of people, because they didn't trust the 3-hour wait, they would actually take their medical records home. So we kind of charged with older people with making sure that all of these records instead went back to the records office with a very, very high success rate. And what we found is that more people started coming to those clinics because people were just not seeking healthcare because they didn't want to go through this and they didn't have the 8 CDs to buy another card. So, very simple. And those 8 fields, turns out that's really all we needed. And amazingly, we actually even started to identify fraud because people may change their name because, for instance, I already have 5 names. So I can be Betty one day and you another. And in some parts of Ghana, you can actually have 2 different last names, but they would not change their phone number. We found one guy who had given his national health ID to something like 8 different people to be using. And we found all that by being able to cross-check the phone number with the person who showed up. So, interesting things. Here's yet another example. So this is a product called Rapid FTR. And I kind of put this example here because I wanted to show that as much as these look very specific to the context, there's definitely instances where it can be used in other parts of the world. So Rapid FTR FTR stands for Family Tracing and Reunification. And it's used particularly in areas of conflict or disaster when you have families that have been split up, either because of war or some national disaster. And just like you see here, there's a child who's missing from the family, doesn't know where his family is. And so there's trained sort of UN, HCR sort of people who know how to talk to the kids, who know how to find the parents and not people who are trying to do anything, evil or untoward, to take their picture, record information about the child so they can verify it with the parents, and eventually match them. The first time this was used was actually in the Congo after there was a crisis. It was actually used in Uganda, where the Congolese had run to. And it was about 10,000 people, which typically with the old carbon-based paper format they used to use, would take about 10 months to get all the kids recorded. They were able to do it in 3 weeks using this technology. And so when, I think it was Yolanda, the Philippines typhoon that was several years ago, I think maybe 5 years ago or so, when that typhoon came, our office who had been involved in this project thought, we need to help. And so the people in the office scraped money together, and all they needed to do was go and buy mobile phones. And we linked up with the UN and actually supported them in the Philippines using this technology from very early days to actually find children who were missing from their families and reunite. So within a few weeks, there was something like 600,000 kids who were actually logged into the system and could be reunited with their families. So, good. Yeah. Some amazing work by amazing people. And this is just preparations for going out to the field. It's all the mobile phones that the specialists use, and that's them charging them before they head out. Mobile first. So one last story. So what we've found in all of this is that, as you can see, the technology itself is very simple, right? It's technology that's been around for quite a while. It's understanding the context and understanding the constraints that we really had to focus on sort of getting right. But what we also realized is that even though we could figure out a solution and we could work with people who understand the context, we found that there is something in the culture as well of Africans that makes them naturally very innovative themselves, right? If you think about it, if you've lived in, necessity is the mother of invention, they say. If you've lived in a highly constrained environment, you figure out ways to make it work. And so what we started doing now is we started trying to tap into that innovation itself to empower people to come up with their own solutions. And then we can support with technology that works. So this is one example. Tony's Chocolonely is a company based in the Netherlands. It was actually started by a journalist who got very concerned about child slavery in the production of cocoa that was used in chocolate around the world. And he tried to start answering the question, like, this chocolate that I'm eating, what percentage of it is tainted by child slavery? Nobody knew. So what he's done now is he actually has suppliers in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire who they review. And so they know that those cocoa producers are not employing or not having children work on their farms, in many cases, for no pay and no support, no food, no proper equipment. And they're too young to be out there in the first place. So we actually partnered with Tony's Chocolonely to actually go out to one of the cocoa producing regions and work with the farmers themselves to help them figure out how to understand their context and start building solutions. And it's amazing the things that they came up with. One of the solutions, for instance, nothing to do with technology, is they found out that to take a bucket and try and water all the plants obviously costs too much. There's no way they're going to be able to afford a tractor or anything like that. But they were able to design a very simple wheelbarrow that had something like 4 slabs. They could put 2 water containers on it, holes that they could then plug, and they could use that to water and still be very accurate in where they applied the water. And they came up with this themselves. They got a local carpenter to actually build it, and voila, they've got a solution. And so now the project is actually moving on to the next phase, where they actually have realized that they do a bit of barter, but we realized that if they have a little bit more spending capital into their farms, there's actually a lot that they can do. And so we're looking at how to get mobile payment to people who don't necessarily have all the devices that a mobile payment provider works. So that's another example. And really, it's all about design thinking and how we bring design thinking. So I don't know if anybody has heard about Experience Point, but Experience Point partnered with IDEO, and so the famous IDEO design thinking company has a methodology, and we are the local representatives in Ghana and Nigeria for that methodology, and we're looking at how to tap into that innovative spirit of the 70% of the people who live in the villages to actually come up with more solutions that we can then support with technology. So I look forward to telling you how that, how that goes. So that's really my presentation, and I think we'll have some time for questions, hopefully. And so, yeah, I'll just take some questions from here, I think. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you.